This class is about scales. The scales are probably the whole nucleus of music. Everything you need to know to understand music is on this sheet. And I know as a beginner, it's kind of scary to look at a scale sheet and go, you know what, look at all those letters of the alphabet with sharps and flats, and they're all different and blah, blah, blah. And if you go to a complicated music class, this can be very scary. But we're going to talk about scales and how they work, because chords come from scales, melodies come from scales. People who play by ear know what keys, the key signatures come from the scales. They know, because they know the scales, they pretty much can do anything with their music. If you don't understand this, then you really don't have a really good basis for your musical background, or your musical career, we'll call it. Because a lot of people can learn to play. You look at the little spots on the notes and you learn a few chords and you learn how to count some easy counting notes, and then you play. But to really understand music and know how it came about and how it works, you got to kind of have an idea of how this works, of how the scales go. Now, to do that, we're going to keep it really, really simple. Now, when I was a kid, and probably if you took music when you were a kid, the teachers made you learn scales, right? I remember, one of my very first lessons, I had to sit down at my teacher's piano and go. Now, in the old days, they said do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay, now, as beginners, you should be able to determine if the scale is right or wrong. Let's just have a little fun and listen. Listen to this scale. Something's wrong. You can tell, can't you? How about this one? That one sounded good to me. How about this one? Different kind of scale. In Iraq, that probably would work. Or Persia, they would call it. All right? So, your ear can tell if it's right or wrong, can't it? All right. So, every week, or sometimes not every week, I had to learn a new scale. Some scales had sharps, some scales had flats. My teacher never really explained to me, number one, why some had sharps and some had flats. Some had 5 sharps, some had 2 flats. She never really explained to me that chords came from scales, because when I took lessons, the word chords were not used. People that played in bars, in lounges, they played chords. Real piano players did not. She didn't tell me that everything in music was based on what I was learning. I thought they were finger warm exercises. So, smart mouth me would say to her, why can't I just warm up my fingers with the C scale? It's easier. Why do I have to learn all these other ones? Well, she knew why, but she didn't tell me. Until I got out of college almost, that I learned that the scales, or in college actually, I learned that scales really control everything in music. Okay, so as a beginner, I want you to be able to, in about 10 minutes, you're going to be able to play all these scales. Because I'm going to teach you the recipe. Okay? There is a recipe for scales. And unfortunately, a lot of teachers don't teach kids or adults what the recipe is. If you know a pattern, like when you sew, I can't make a dress with or without a pattern, actually. I never sewed anything that fit me. But when you sew something, if you have the pattern, you're pretty secure in knowing, hopefully, that the dress is going to turn out the way the pattern says. For me, the sleeves just never worked. But the same thing is true with this. If you follow a recipe in a recipe book, exactly the way it's written, chances are that what you cook will match the picture in the book, won't it? Yes. You don't have to say that with much confidence, but that's okay. All right, here's how scales work. Scales are a series of half and whole steps. That's all. So I just want you to put your angst away and just relax in this and go, okay, half step is what? The distance from one note directly to the next, remember, is a half tone. We talked about that on how you build chords. All right, so from B to C, there is no note in between, right? So is it a half step or a whole step? It's a half. There is no note that can sound between those two. How about here? That's a half. Half. Whole. Whole. Half. Half. You're saying it with confidence now. That's good. Whole. See, there's a note there. Now, is anybody not with me? Because if you're not with me now, you're not going to be with me the rest of the lesson. Do y'all get half and wholes? How about here? Half. Whole. Half. You got it. Now you're speaking with confidence. All right. Here's the rule for a scale. Think like a child and don't try to analyze this. Okay? The rule for a scale is you play the first note. If I say play an F scale, you will put your thumb on an F. All right? And you go up 2 whole steps. Okay? The next 2 notes are 2 whole steps, and I'll show you in a minute. And then a half step, and then 3 whole steps, and a half step. That is the recipe for a major scale. 2.5 and 3.5.
That's an F scale, or that's
It's any scale. That is what you need to remember. So let's say it together. 2.5 and 3.5. All right, now watch. It's so simple after this, and I'm not even going to use the right fingers. I'm just going to use one. I'm just going to pick a note. Well, let's pick C. Okay? So I'm going to make a C scale. From this note, I'm going to go up 2 whole steps. So C, a whole step from C is what? D. What's a whole step from D? E. From there, I need to play a half step. F. Whole step? G. Whole step? A. Whole step? B. And if we're lucky, it's a half step at the very end, back to C. You will start on a C, and you will end on a C. Now, because the keyboard is arranged with 2 black keys and 3 and 2 and 3, you can't, that's why there's sharps and flats. Now, this is the explanation for why some scales have sharps and some scales have flats.